Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
Beginning in the 1980s, Minnesota has encouraged refugees seeking asylum, most notably from Hmong and Somali communities, to establish a new home in the land of 10,000 lakes. Changing immigration policy and expanded outreach efforts are driving dramatic demographic shifts in our state. From 1980 to 2011, the percentage of foreign-born Minnesotans rose from 3% to more than 7%. Today, Minnesota is home to the second largest Hmong population and the largest Somali population in the U.S. And since 1990, the Latino population in the state has tripled. But a recent report from the Minneapolis-based Advocates for Human Rights shows that while Minnesota officially welcomes immigrants and refugees, the welcome quickly wears out for some. About 17% of immigrant families live in poverty in Minnesota compared to 5.5% of those native-born. Immigrants and refugees often lack access to quality education, housing, and employment. This month on Access Minnesota, we'll learn more about the findings in the report titled Moving from Exclusion to Belonging, and how Minnesota can better address the needs of foreign-born newcomers. The Advocates for Human Rights published a report in March on the human rights of refugees and immigrants in Minnesota. We're talking with two staff members from the Advocates. Michelle Garnett is the Director of Advocacy and Robin Phillips is the Executive Director. Michelle, Robin, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yes, first, tell us about the Advocates for Human Rights organization. What's your mission?
Well, we're an international human rights organization based in Minneapolis, and our mission is to implement international human rights standards in Minnesota, the United States, and in select countries around the world. We work with projects ranging from women's human rights to refugee and immigrant rights. We work on international justice issues, which include working with diaspora communities in Minnesota and around the country on projects that affect the human rights in their home countries. And we work with education, research, and advocacy to implement our different projects.
Tell us about the process of compiling the report. How many people did you speak to, and which immigrant and refugee communities did you reach out to?
Right. Well, we spent actually several years working on this project. This came out of work that we'd been doing to support welcoming community initiatives and sort of new American centers and advocates who are working with refugees and immigrants around Minnesota for several years. And again, as we were kind of looking at our work with them, wanted to say, you know, how are we doing in making a difference in making this a better community? We need kind of a baseline on what that was looking like. So part of the work that we did was reach out to hundreds of our partners around the state who do work with immigrants and refugees, immigrant and refugee-led organizations. So we were in all parts of the state, in small towns and in large towns, in the Twin Cities and in greater Minnesota. So that was part of the process. The other was holding community conversations throughout Minnesota that involved both long-term residents and new Americans in those conversations. What does a welcoming community look like to you? Was one of the questions we asked. Not what human rights violations have you experienced, but really what does Minnesota look like to you? How does that feel? What's been a good experience? What's made you feel like you weren't part of the community? And started to compile that and use that as the starting point for individual interviews. So we did about 25 of those community conversations, and then started interviewing folks, a lot of service providers who work directly with communities who are able to see patterns and practices with individual immigrants from a variety of countries, from all regions of the state and all regions of the world, and people who'd been here for just a few years and people who'd been here for 20 or 30 years. Their experiences are different when you have that chance. So it was a real mix. We talked to over 200 people in individual interviews and then hundreds more in those conversations to gather the information.
Now, how does this recent report, Moving from Exclusion to Belonging, fit into the overall mission of the organization?
Right. Well, the Advocates for Human Rights has been working to provide free legal services to refugees seeking asylum in the United States for over 30 years now. And coming out of that, we've built deep relationships with the communities and also really had a chance to observe how immigration policy and how Minnesota's state and local policies impact people as they try to rebuild their lives here in Minnesota. So throughout the past several years, we've worked particularly to combat anti-immigrant sentiment and wanted to take a look at how Minnesota was doing in moving from a point of new arrivals to acceptance and inclusion in our communities. So this report really was an attempt to look at how Minnesota's doing, what we could improve on, what we're doing really well, and where we should be going in the future.
How do we define human rights?
That's a good question. The basic answer is it's the rights we all have by virtue of being human beings. And there have been many efforts to define that. We work with international human rights standards, and those are agreed upon standards from countries around the world, generally articulated by the United Nations. But we also work with human rights issues as defined by the state of Minnesota, by the local governments and different ordinances related to human rights. But generally our mission relates to international human rights standards.
Tell us about some of the violations of human rights that we're seeing in Minnesota today.
So with our report, I'll start there and then we can talk about some other issues. But with our report, we're seeing racial profiling and violations of due process rights for refugees and immigrants and people perceived to be immigrants, which is part of the issue that we've been looking into. We see issues related to discrimination in workplace conditions that we are intending to even do more research on, and we in this report do a survey over a number of issues, and we've discovered many issues related to workplace discrimination and other sort of targeted practices against immigrants and people without documentation.
So in addition to some of those most egregious areas around due process violations and around the workplace employment practices that have really been disturbing, we also see that the access to housing, education systems, sort of the day-to-day experience that people have often impact immigrants and refugees in really different ways than the people who've been born and raised here. But also we see that many of those issues relate to poverty and to racism. And so those intersections are really something that need to be looked at. It's not just the immigrant experience, but it's really related to class and poverty, to race in this country that can impact people's ability to live with dignity.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll discuss the pressures of assimilation for immigrant communities and why racism remains an issue in our state.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.